Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Eldritch Archives. Today, I have another story from John Buchan for you. The story is called No Man's Land, and it's probably the most well-known story of John Buchan's weird fiction catalogue. In addition to being a mystery and an adventure story, No Man's Land could also be considered a folk horror story as well. John Buchan was a fascinating person. He extensively travelled the world, living in several countries. Buchan was born and grew up in Scotland, though, and Scottish folklore and landscapes feature prominently in many of his stories. In his stories, which are set in Scotland, Buchan often likes to include Scottish dialect and writes phonetically to emphasise the pronunciation. For the person reading these stories for an audiobook, like I am, this always presents a bit of a difficult problem. To stay true to the story as it was written, I have tried my best to maintain the dialect and pronunciation as written in the story. If you do find the dialect difficult to follow, I recommend that you seek out the text version of the story and read along. I will put a link to a PDF of the story in the description below. And now, let's get to the story. I hope you enjoy. No Man's Land by John Buchan. Read by Connor Kay. 1. The Shielding of Farawa. It was with a light heart and a pleasing consciousness of holiday that I set out from the inn at Allermuir to tramp my 15 miles into the unknown. I walked slowly, for I carried my equipment on my back, my basket, fly books, and rod, my plaid of Grant tartan, for I boast myself a distant kinsman of that house, and my great staff, which had tried ere then the front of the steeper Alps. A small valise with books and some changes of linen clothing had been sent on ahead in the shepherd's own hands. It was yet early April, and before me lay 4 weeks of freedom, 28 blessed days in which to take fish and smoke the pipe of idleness. The Lent term had pulled me down. A week of modest enjoyment thereafter in town had finished the work, and I drank in the sharp Moorish air like a thirsty man who has been forewandered among deserts. I am a man of varied tastes and a score of interests. As an undergraduate, I had been filled with the old mania for the complete life. I distinguished myself in the schools, rode in my college 8, and reached the distinction of practicing for 3 weeks in the trials. I had dabbled in a score of learned activities, and when the time came, I won the inevitable St. Chad's Fellowship on my chaotic acquirements, and I found myself compelled to select if I would pursue a scholar's life. I had some toil in finding my vocation. In the end, I resolved that the ancient life of the North, of the Celts and the Northmen and the unknown Pictish tribes, held for me a chief fascination. I had acquired a smattering of Gaelic, having been brought up as a boy in Lochaber, and now I set myself to increase my store of languages. I mastered Erse and Icelandic, and my first book, a monograph on the probable Celtic elements in the Eddic songs, brought me the praise of scholars and the deputy professor's chair of Northern Antiquities. So much for Oxford. My vacations had been spent mainly in the north, in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isles, in Scandinavia and Iceland, once even in the far limits of Finland. I was a keen sportsman of a sort, an old experienced fisher, a fair shot with gun and rifle, and in my hillcraft I might well stand comparison with most men. April has ever seemed to me the finest season of the year, even in our cold north altitudes, and the memory of many bright Aprils had brought me up from the south on the night before to Allerfoot, whence a dog-cart had taken me up the Glen Aller to the inn at Allermuir. And now the same desire had set me on the heather with my face to the cold brown hills. You are to picture a sort of plateau, benty and rock-strewn, running ridgewise above a chain of little peaty lochs and a vast tract of inexorable bog. In a mile the ridge ceased in the shoulder of hill, and over this lay the head of another glen, with the same doleful accompaniment of sunless lochs, mosses, and a shining and resolute water. East and west and north, in every direction save the south, rose walls of gashed and serrated hills. It was a grey day with blinks of sun, and when a ray chanced to fall on one of the great dark faces, lines of light and colour sprang into being, which told of mica and granite. I was in high spirits, as on the eve of holiday. I had breakfasted excellently on eggs and salmon steaks. I had no cares to speak of, and my prospects were not uninviting. But, in spite of myself, the landscape began to take me in thrall and crush me. The silent, vanished peoples of the hills seemed to be stirring. Dark, primeval faces seemed to stare at me from behind boulders and jags of rock. The place was so still, so free from the cheerful clamour of nesting birds, that it seemed a temenos sacred to some old-world god. At my feet the lochs lapped ceaselessly, but the waters were so dark that one could not see the bottom a foot from the edge. On my right the links of green told of snake-like mires waiting to crush the unwary wanderer. It seemed to me for the moment a land of death, where the tongues of the dead cried aloud for recognition. My whole morning's walk was full of such fancies. I lit a pipe to cheer me, but the thing would not be got rid of. I thought of the Gaels who had held those fastnesses. I thought of the Britons before them, who yielded to their advent. They were all strong peoples in their day, but now they had gone the way of the earth. They had left their mark on the levels of the glens and on the more habitable uplands, both in names and in actual forts, and graves where men might still dig curios. But the hills, that black, stony amphitheatre before me, it seemed strange that the hills bore no traces of them. And then, with some uneasiness, I reflected on that older and stranger race who was said to have held the hilltops, the Picts, the Picti. What in the name of goodness were they? They had troubled me in all my studies, a sort of blank wall to put an end to speculation. We knew nothing of them, save certain strange names which men called Pictish, the names of those hills in front of me, the Monorail, the Yerney, the Calmartin. They were the corpus vile for learned experiment, but heaven only knew what dark abyss of savagery once yawned in the midst of the desert. And then I remembered the crazy theories of a pupil of mine at St. Chad's, the son of a small landowner on the Aller, a young gentleman who had spent his substance too freely at Oxford, and was now dreeing his weird in the backwoods. He had been no scholar, but a certain imagination marked all his doings, and of a Sunday night he would come and talk to me of the North. The Picts were his special subject, and his ideas were mad. "Listen to me," he would say, when I had mixed him toddy and given him one of my cigars. "I believe there are traces, aye, and more than traces, of an old culture lurking in those hills and waiting to be discovered. We never hear of the Picts being driven from the hills. The Britons drove them from the lowlands. The Gaels from Ireland did the same for the Britons, but the hills were left unmolested. We hear of no one going near them except outlaws and tinklers. And in that very place, you have the strangest mythology. Take the story of the brownie. What is that but the story of a little swart man of uncommon strength and cleverness, who does good and ill indiscriminately, and then disappears? There are many scholars, as you yourself confess, who think that the origin of the brownie was in some mad belief in the old race of the Picts, which still survived somewhere in the hills. And do we not hear of the brownie in authentic records right down to the year 1756? After that, when people grew more incredulous, it is natural that the belief should have begun to die out. But I do not see why stray traces should not have survived till late. Do you not see what that means? I had said in mock gravity. Those same hills are, if anything, less known now than they were 100 years ago. Why should not your Picts or brownies be living to this day? Why not indeed? He had rejoined in all seriousness. I laughed, and he went to his rooms and returned with a large leather-bound book. It was lettered in the Rococo style of a young man's taste, glimpses of the unknown, and some of the said glimpses he proceeded to impart to me. It was not pleasant reading. Indeed, I had rarely heard anything so well fitted to shatter sensitive nerves. The early part consisted of folk tales and folk sayings, some of them wholly obscure, some of them with a glint of meaning, but all of them with some hint of a mystery in the hills. I heard the brownie story in countless versions. Now the thing was a friendly little man who wore grey breeches and lived on brogue. Now he was a twisted being, the sight of which made the ewes miscarry in the lambing time. But the second part was the stranger, for it was made up of actual tales, most of them with date and place appended. It was a most bedlamite catalogue of horrors, which, if true, made the wholesome moors a place instinct with tragedy. Some told of children carried away from villages, even from towns, on the verge of the uplands. In almost every case they were girls, and the strange fact was their utter disappearance. 2 little girls would be coming home from school, would be seen last by a neighbour just where the road crossed a patch of heath or entered a wood, and then no human eye ever saw them again. Children's cries had startled outlying shepherds in the night, and when they had rushed to the door, they could hear nothing but the night wind. The instances of such disappearances were not very common, perhaps once in 20 years, but they were confined to this one tract of country, and came in a sort of fixed progression from the middle of last century, when the record began. But this was only one side of the history. The latter part was all devoted to a chronicle of crimes which had gone unpunished, seeing that no hand had ever been traced. The list was fuller in the last century. Footnote 1. The narrative of Mr. Graves was written in the year 1898. In the early years of the present, it had dwindled. Then came a revival about the 50s, and now again, in our own time, it had sunk low. At the little cottage of Auchterbrien, on the roadside in Glen Aller, a labourer's wife had been found pierced to the heart. It was thought to be a case of a woman's jealousy, and her neighbour was accused, convicted, and hanged. The woman, to be sure, denied the charge with her last breath, but circumstantial evidence seemed sufficiently strong against her. Yet some people in the glen believed her guiltless. In particular, the carrier, who had found the dead woman, declared that the way in which her neighbour received the news was a sufficient proof of innocence, and the doctor, who was first summoned, professed himself unable to tell with what instrument the wound had been given. But this was all before the days of expert evidence, so the woman had been hanged without scruple. Then there had been another story of peculiar horror, telling of the death of an old man at some little lonely shieling called Carrickfay. But at this point I had risen in protest and made to drive the young idiot from my room. "It was my grandfather who collected most of them," he said. "He had theories, but people called him mad, so he was wise enough to hold his tongue. My father declares the whole thing mania, but I rescued the book, had it bound, and added to the collection. It is a queer hobby, but, as I say, I have theories, and there are more things in heaven and earth." But at this he heard a friend's voice in the quad and dived out, leaving the banal quotation unfinished. Footnote 2. In the light of subsequent events, I have jotted down the materials to which I refer. The last authentic record of the brownie is in the narrative of The Shepherd of the Clacklins, taken down towards the close of last century by the Reverend Mr. Gillespie, minister of Allerkirk, and included by him in his Songs and Legends of Glen Aller. The authorities on the strange carrying away of children are to be found in a series of articles in a local paper, the Allerfoot Advertiser, September and October 1878, and a curious book published anonymously in Edinburgh in 1848 entitled The Weather Gore. The records of the unexplained murders in the same neighbourhood are all contained in Mr. Fordoon's Theory of Expert Evidence, and an attack on the book in The Law Review for June 1881. The Carrickfay case has a pamphlet to itself, now extremely rare, a copy of which was recently obtained in a bookseller's shop in Dumfries by a well-known antiquary and presented to the Library of the Supreme Court in Edinburgh. Strange though it may seem, this madness kept coming back to me as I crossed the last few miles of moor. I was now on a rough tableland, the watershed between two lochs, and beyond and above me rose the stony backs of the hills. The burns fell down in a chaos of granite boulders, and huge slabs of grey stone lay flat and tumbled in the heather. The full waters looked prosperously for my fishing, and I began to forget all fancies in anticipation of sport. Then, suddenly, in a hollow of land, I came on a ruined cottage. It had been a very small place, but the walls were still half erect, and the little moorland garden was outlined on the turf. A lonely apple tree, twisted and gnarled with winds, stood in the midst. From higher up on the hill, I heard a loud roar, and I knew my excellent friend, the shepherd of Farawa, who had come thus far to meet me. He greeted me with the boisterous embarrassment which was his way of prefacing hospitality. A grave, reserved man at other times, on such occasions he thought it proper to relapse into hilarity. I fell into step with him, and we set off for his dwelling. But first I had the curiosity to look back at the tumble-down cottage and ask him its name. A queer look came into his eyes. "They call the place Carrickfay," he said. "Naebody has dared to bide there this 20 years since. But I see ye ken the story." And as if glad to leave the subject, he hastened to discourse on fishing. Two. Tells of an evening's talk. The shepherd was a masterful man, tall, save for the stoop which belongs to all moorland folk, and as active as a wild goat. He was not a new importation, nor did he belong to the place, for his people had lived in the remote borders, and he had come as a boy to this Shielding of Farawa. He was unmarried, but an elderly sister lived with him and cooked his meals. He was reputed to be extraordinarily skillful in his trade. I know for a fact that he was, in his way, a keen sportsman, and his few neighbours gave him credit for a sincere piety. Doubtless this last report was due to his silence, for after his first greeting, he was wont to relapse into a singular taciturnity. As we strode across the heather, he gave me a short outline of his year's lambing. 5 pairs of twins yestreen, 2 this morn. That makes 35 ewes that have lambed since the Sabbath. I'll do well, if God's willing. Then, as I looked toward the hilltops, whence the thin mist of morn was trailing, he followed my gaze. See, he said, with uplifted crook, see that sight. Is that no what is written of in the Bible when it says the mountains do smoke? And with this piece of exegesis, he finished his talk, and in a little we were at the cottage. It was a small enough dwelling in truth, and yet large for a moorland house, for it had a garret below the thatch, which was given up to my sole enjoyment. Beyond was the wide kitchen with box beds, and next to it the inevitable second room, also with its cupboard sleeping places. The interior was very clean, and yet I remember to have been struck with the faint musty smell which is inseparable from the moorland dwellings. The kitchen pleased me best, for there the great rafters were black with peat reek, and the uncovered stone floor, on which the fire gleamed dully, gave an air of primeval simplicity. But the walls spoiled all, for tawdry things of today had penetrated even there. Some grocers' almanacs, years old, hung in places of honour, and an extraordinary lithograph of the royal family in its youth. And this, mind you, between crooks and fishing rods and old guns and horns of sheep and deer. The life, for the first day or two, was regular and placid. I was up early, breakfasted on porridge, a dish which I detest, and then off to the lochs and streams. At first, my sport prospered mightily. With a drake wing, I killed a salmon of 17 pounds, and the next day had a fine basket of trout from a hill burn. Then, for no earthly reason, the weather changed. A bitter wind came out of the northeast, bringing showers of snow and stinging hail, and lashing the waters into storm. It was all farewell to fly fishing. For a day or two I tried trolling with the minnow on the lochs, but it was poor sport, for I had no boat, and the edges were soft and mossy. Then, in disgust, I gave up the attempt, went back to the cottage, lit my biggest pipe, and sat down with a book to await the turn of the weather. The shepherd was out from morning till night at his work, and when he came in at last, dog-tired, his face would be set and hard, and his eyes heavy with sleep. The strangeness of the man grew upon me. He had a shrewd brain beneath his thatch of hair, for I had tried him once or twice and found him abundantly intelligent. He had some smattering of education, like all Scottish peasants, and, as I have said, he was deeply religious. I set him down as a fine type of his class, sober, serious, keenly critical, free from the bondage of superstition. But I rarely saw him, and our talk was chiefly in monosyllables, short interjected accounts of the number of lambs dead or alive on the hills. Then he would produce a pencil and notebook and be immersed in some calculation, and finally he would be revealed sleeping heavily in his chair till his sister wakened him and he stumbled off to bed. So much for the ordinary course of life. But one day, the second, I think, of the bad weather, the extraordinary happened. The storm had passed in the afternoon into a resolute and blinding snow, and the shepherd, finding it hopeless on the hill, came home about 3 o'clock. I could make out from his way of entering that he was in a great temper. He kicked his feet savagely against the doorpost. Then he swore at his dogs, a thing I'd never heard him do before. "Hell," he cried, "can ye no keep out of my road, ye Brits?" Then he came sullenly into the kitchen, thawed his numbed hands at the fire, and sat down to his meal. I made some aimless remark about the weather. "Death to man and beast," he grunted. "I have got the sheep down from the hill, but the lambs will never throw this. We must pray that it will nae last." His sister came in with some dish. "Margaret," he cried, "3 lambs away this morning, and 3 dead with the hole in the throat." The woman's face visibly paled. "God help us, Adam. That hasna happened this 3 year." "It has happened noo," he said surlily. "But by God, if it happens again, I'll gae myself to the Scarts of the Monorail." "Oh, Adam," the woman cried shrilly, "hold your tongue. Ye kenna what hears ye." And with a frightened glance at me, she left the room. I asked no questions, but waited till the shepherd's anger should cool, but the cloud did not pass so lightly. When he had finished his dinner, he pulled his chair to the fire and sat staring moodily. He made some sort of apology to me for his conduct. "I'm sorry, troubled sir, but I'm vexed ye should see me like this. Maybe things will look better at the morn." And then, lighting his short black pipe, he resigned himself to his meditations. But he could not keep quiet. Some nervous unrest seemed to possess the man. He got up with a start and went to the window, where the snow was drifting unsteadily past. As he stared out into the storm, I heard him mutter to himself, "3 away, God help me, and 3 with the hole in the throat." And then he turned round to me abruptly. I was jotting down notes for an article I contemplated in the Revue Celtique, so my thoughts were far away from the present. The man recalled me by demanding fiercely, "Do ye believe in God?" I gave him some sort of answer in the affirmative. "Then do ye believe in the devil?" he asked. The reply must have been less satisfactory, for he came forward and flung himself violently into the chair before me. "What do ye ken aboot it?" he cried. "Ye that bides in the southern tune, what can ye ken of the God that works in the hills and the devil? Aye, the manifold devils, that he suffers to bide there. I tell ye, man, that if ye had seen what I had seen, ye would be on your knees at this moment, praying to God to pardon your unbelief. There are devils at the back of every stone, and hiding in every clough, and it's by the grace of God alone that man is alive upon the earth." His voice had risen high and shrill, and then suddenly he cast a frightened glance towards the window and was silent. I began to think that the man's wits were unhinged, and the thought did not give me satisfaction. I had no relish for the prospect of being left alone in this moorland dwelling with the cheerful company of a maniac. But his next movements reassured me. He was clearly only dead tired, for he fell sound asleep in his chair, and by the time his sister brought tea and wakened him, he seemed to have got the better of his excitement. When the window was shuttered and the lamp lit, I set myself again to the completion of my notes. The shepherd had got out his Bible and was solemnly reading, with one great finger travelling down the lines. He was smoking, and whenever some text came home to him with power, he would make pretense to underline it with the end of the stem. Soon I had finished the work I desired, and, my mind being full of my pet hobby, I fell in an inquisitive frame of mind, and began to question the solemn man opposite on the antiquities of the place. He stared stupidly at me when I asked him concerning monuments or ancient weapons. "I kenna," he said. "There is a heap of queer things in the hills. This place should be a centre for such relics. You know that the name of the hill behind the house, as far as I can make it out, means Place of the Little Men. It's a good Gaelic word, though there is some doubt about its exact interpretation. But clearly, the Gaelic peoples did not speak of themselves when they gave that name. They must have referred to some older and stranger population." The shepherd looked at me dully, as not understanding. "It is partly this fact, besides the fishing, of course, which interests me in this countryside," I said gaily. Again, he cast the same queer, frightened glance toward the window. "If you'll take the advice of an older man," he said slowly, "you'll let well alone and no meddle with uncanny things." I laughed pleasantly, for at last I had found out my hard-headed host in a piece of childishness. "Why, I thought that you, of all men, would be free from superstition." "What do ye call superstition?" he asked. "A belief in old wives' tales," said I. "A trust in the crude supernatural and the patently impossible." He looked at me beneath his shaggy brows. "How do ye ken what is impossible? Mind ye, sir, ye're no in the town just now, but in the thick of the wild hills." "But hang it all, man," I cried. "You don't seem to say you believe in that sort of thing. I am prepared for many things up here, but not for the brownie, though, to be sure, if one could meet him in the flesh, it would be rather pleasant than otherwise, for he is a companionable sort of fellow. When a thing puts the fear of death on a man, he aye speaks well of it." It was true, the humanities and the good folk over again, and I awoke with interest to the fact that the conversation was getting into strange channels. The shepherd moved uneasily in his chair. "I am a man that fears God, and has nae time for daft stories, but I have not travelled the hills for 20 years with my eyes shut. If I say that I could tell ye stories of faces seen in the mist, and queer things that have knocked against me in the snow, would ye believe me? I'd wager ye wouldna. Ye would say I had been drunk, and yet I am a God-fearing, temperate man." He rose and went to a cupboard, unlocked it, and brought out something in his hand, which he held out to me. I took it with some curiosity, and found that it was a flint arrowhead. Clearly a flint arrowhead, and yet like none that I had ever seen in any collection. For one thing, it was larger, and the barb less clumsily thick. More, the chipping was new, or comparatively so. This thing had not stood the wear of 1,500 years among the stones of the hillside. Now, there are, I regret to say, institutions which manufacture primitive relics, but it is not hard for a practiced eye to see the difference. The chipping has either a regularity and a balance which is unknown in the real thing, or the rudeness has been overdone, and the result is an implement incapable of harming a mortal creature. But this was the real thing if it ever existed, and yet I was prepared to swear on my reputation that it was not half a century old. "Where did you get this?" I asked with some nervousness. "I have a story about that," said the shepherd. "Outside the door there, you can see a muckle flat stone against the books. One summer night, I was sitting there smoking till the dark, and I wager there was naething on the stone then. But that same night, when I woke with a queer thought, as if there were folk moving around the house, folk that dinna make muckle noise, I mind a looking out the window, and I could have sworn I saw something black moving among the heather and into the box. Now, I had maybe 60 lambs there that night, for I had to take them many miles off in the early morning. Well, when I gets up about 4 o'clock and goes out, when I'm passing the muckle stone, I find this bit arrow. 'That's come here in the night,' says I, and I wondered a wee bit and put it in my pouch. But when I came to my fields, what did I see? 5 of my best hogs were away, and 3 more were lying dead with a hole in the throat." "Who in the world?" I began. "Do nae ask," said he. If I once started to spare about their matters, I wouldn't keep my reason. Then that was what happened on the hill this morning. Even so, it has happened more than once since that time. It's the most uncanny slaughter. For sheep stealing, I can understand. But no, this pricking of the poor beast's wizens, I kenna how they date either, for it's no with a knife, nor any common tool. Have you ever tried to follow the thieves? Have I no? He asked grimly. If it had been common sheep stealers, I would have had 'em by the heels, though I had followed them 100 miles. But this is no common. I've tracked them, and it's ill they are to track. But I never got beyond a place, and that was the Scarts of the Monorail, that ye've heard me speak o'. But who in heaven's name are the people? Tinklers or poachers or what? Aye, he said dryly. Even so, tinklers and poachers will nae work with stone arrows and kill sheep by a hole in their throat. Lord, I kenna know what they are, unless they're the muckle devil himself. The conversation had passed beyond my comprehension. In this prosaic, hard-headed man, I had come on the dead rock of superstition and blind fear. That is only the story of the brownie over again, and he is an exploded myth, I said, laughing. Are ye the man that exploded it? Said the shepherd rudely. I trow no, neither you nor any other. My bonny man, if ye lived a 12-month in the hills, ye would sing softer about exploded myths, as ye call them. I tell you what I would do. If I lost sheep, as you lose them, I would go up the Scarts of the Monorail and never rest until I had settled the question once and for all. I spoke hotly, for I was vexed by the man's childish fear. I dare say you would, he said slowly. But then I am no you, and maybe I ken mair of what's in the Scarts of the Monorail. Maybe I ken that, whilk, if ye kenned it, would send ye back to the South Country with your heart in your mouth. But, as I say, I am no so brave as you. For I saw something the first year of my herding here which put the terror of God on me and makes me a fearful man to this day. Ye ken the story of the goodman of Carrickfay? I nodded. Well, I was the man that found him. I had seen the dead afore, and I've seen him since, but never have I seen aught like the look in that man's eye. What he saw at his death, I may see the morn, so I walk before the Lord in fear. Then he rose and stretched himself. It's bedding time, for I maun be up at 3. And with a short good night, he left the room. Chapter 3. The Scarts of the Monorail. The next morning was fine, for the snow had been intermittent, and had soon melted except in the high corries. True, it was deceptive weather, for the wind had gone to the rainy southwest, and the masses of cloud on that horizon boded ill for the afternoon. But some days' inaction had made me keen for a chance of sport, so I rose with the shepherd and set out for the day. He asked me where I proposed to begin. I told him the tarn called the Loch of the Threshers, which lies over the back of the Monorail and on another watershed. It is on the ground of the Rhin's forest, and I had fished it of old from the forest house. I knew the merits of the trout, and I knew its virtues in a southwest wind, so I had resolved to go thus far afield. The shepherd heard the name in silence. Your best road will be over that rig, and thin on to the water of Coulds. Keep aboon the moss till ye come to the place they call Nick of the Threshers. That will take ye to the very loch side, but it's a lang road and a sair. The road was breaking over the bleak hills. Little clouds drifted athwart the corries, and wisps of haze fluttered from the peaks. A great rosy flush lay over one side of the glen, which caught the edge of the sluggish bog pools and turned them to fire. Never before had I seen the mountain land so clear, for far back into the east and west I saw mountain tops set as close as flowers in a border, black crags seamed with silver lines which I knew for mighty waterfalls, and below at my feet the lower slopes fresh with the dewy green of spring. A name stuck in my memory from the last night's talks. "Where are the Scarts of the Monorail?" I asked. The shepherd pointed to the great hill which bears the name, and which lies, a huge mass, above the watershed. "Do you see yon corrie at the east that runs straight up the side? It looks a bit scart, but it's sae deep that it's aye dark at the bottom out. Well, at the top of the rig it meets another corrie that runs down the other side, and that one they call the Scarts. There is a sort of burn in it that flows until the Dool, and sae into the Aller. And, indeed, if ye were gone there, it would be from Aller Glen that your best road would lie. But it's an ill bit, and ye'll be sae acquainted if ye try't." There he left me, and went across the glen, while I struck upward over the ridge. At the top I halted and looked down on the wide glen of the Calds, which is there little better than a bog, but lower down grows into a green pastoral valley. The great Monorail still dominated the landscape, and the black scar on its side seemed blacker than before. The place fascinated me, for in that fresh morning air the shepherd's fears seemed monstrous. "Some day," I said to myself, "I will go and explore the whole of that mighty hill." Then I descended and struggled over the moss, found the neck, and in 2 hours' time was on the loch's edge. I have little in the way of good to report of the fishing. For perhaps 1 hour the trout took well. After that they sulked steadily for the day. The promise, too, of fine weather had been deceptive. By midday the rain was falling in that soft, soaking fashion which gives no hope of clearing. The mist was down to the edge of the water, and I cast my flies into a blind sea of white. It was hopeless work, and yet, from a sort of ill temper, I stuck to it long after my better judgment had warned me of its folly. At last, about 3 in the afternoon, I struck my camp, and prepared myself for a long and toilsome retreat. And a long and toilsome retreat it was, beyond anything I have ever encountered. Had I a vestige of sense, I would have followed the burn from the loch down to the forest house. The place was shut up, but the keeper would gladly have given me shelter for the night. But foolish pride was too strong in me. I had found my road in mist before, and could do it again. Before I got to the top of the hill, I had repented my decision. When I got there, I repented it more, for below me was a dizzy chaos of grey. There was no visible landmark. And before me I knew was the bog through which the Calds water twined. I had crossed it with some trouble in the morning, but then I had light to pick my steps. Now I could only stumble on, and in 5 minutes I would be in a bog hole, and in 5 more in a better world. But there was no help to be got from hesitation, so, with a rueful courage, I set off. The place was, if possible, worse than I had feared. Wading up to the knees with nothing before you but a blank wall of mist, and the cheerful consciousness that your next step may be your last. Such was my state for 1 weary mile. The stream itself was high and rose to my armpits, and once and again I only saved myself by a violent leap backwards from a pitiless green slough. But at last it was past, and I was once more on the solid ground of the hillside. Now, in the thick weather, I had crossed the glen much lower down than in the morning, and the result was that the hill on which I stood was one of the giants which, with the Monorail for centre, guard the watershed. Had I taken the proper way, the neck of the Threshers would have led me to the Calds, and then, once over the bog, a little ridge was all that stood between me and the glen of Farawa. But instead, I had come a wild cross-country road and was now, though I did not know it, nearly as far from my destination as at the start. Well for me that I did not know, for I was wet and dispirited, and had I not fancied myself all but home, I should scarcely have had the energy to make this last ascent. But soon I found it was not the little ridge I had expected. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 5 o'clock, when, after the weariest climb, I lay on a piece of level ground which seemed the top. I was not surprised to find that it was now 7. The darkening must be at hand, and sure enough, the mist seemed to be deepening into a greyish black. I began to grow desperate. Here I was, on the summit of some infernal mountain, without any certainty where my road lay. I was lost with a vengeance, and at the thought I began to be acutely afraid. I took what seemed to me the way I had come and began to descend steeply. Then something made me halt, and the next instant I was lying on my face, trying painfully to retrace my steps. For I had found myself slipping, and before I could stop, my feet were dangling over a precipice, with heaven only knows how many yards of sheer mist between me and the bottom. Then I tried keeping the ridge, and took that to the right, which I thought would bring me nearer home. It was no good trying to think out a direction, for in the fog my brain was running around, and I seemed to stand on a pinpoint of space where the laws of the compass had ceased to hold. There was the roughest sort of walking, now stepping warily over the acres of loose stones, now crawling down the face of some battered rock, and now wading in the long dripping heather. The soft rain had begun to fall again, which completed my discomfort. I was now seriously tired, and, like all men who in their day have bent too much over books, I began to feel it in my back. My spine ached, and my breath came in short, broken pants. It was a pitiable state of affairs for an honest man who had never encountered much great discomfort. To ease myself, I was compelled to leave my blanket behind me, trusting to return and find it, if I should ever reach safety and discover on what pathless hill I had been strayed. My rod I used as a staff, but it was of little use, for my fingers were getting too numb to hold it. Suddenly, from the blankness, I heard a sound as of human speech. At first I thought it mere craziness, the cry of a weasel or a hill bird distorted by my ears. But again it came, thick and faint, as through acres of mist, and yet clearly the sound of articulate speaking men. In a moment I lost my despair, and cried out in answer. This was some forewandered traveller like myself, and between us we could surely find some road to safety. So I yelled back at the pitch of my voice and waited intently. But the sound ceased, and there was utter silence again. Still I waited, and then, from some place much nearer, came the same soft, mumbling speech. I could make nothing of it. Heard in that drear place, it made the nerves tense and the heart timorous. It was the strangest jumble of vowels and consonants I had ever heard. A dozen solutions flashed through my brain. It was some maniac talking Jabberwock to himself. It was some belated traveller whose wits had given out in fear. Perhaps it was only some shepherd who was amusing himself thus, and whiling the way with nonsense. Once again I cried out and waited. Then suddenly, in the hollow trough of mist before me, where things could still be half discerned, there appeared a figure. It was small and squat and dark, naked apparently, but so rough with hair that it wore the appearance of a skin-covered being. It crossed my line of vision, not staying for a moment, but in its face and eyes there seemed to lurk an elder world of mystery and barbarism, a troll-like life which was too horrible for words. The shepherd's fear came back on me like a thunderclap. For one awful instant, my legs failed me, and I had almost fallen. The next, I had turned and ran shrieking up the hill. If he who may read this narrative has never felt the force of an overmastering terror, then let him thank his Maker and pray that he never may. I am no weak child, but a strong grown man, accredited, in general, with sound sense and little suspected of hysterics. And yet I went up that brave face with my heart fluttering like a bird and my throat aching with fear. I screamed in short, dry gasps, involuntarily, for my mind was beyond any purpose. I felt that beast-like clutch at my throat. Those red eyes seemed to be staring at me from the mist. I heard, ever behind me and before, and on all sides, the patter of those inhuman feet. Before I knew, I was down, slipping over a rock, and falling some dozen feet into a soft, marshy hollow. I was conscious of lying still for a second and whimpering like a child. But as I lay there, I awoke to the silence of the place. There was no sound of pursuit. Perhaps they had lost my track and given up. My courage began to return, and from this it was an easy step to hope. Perhaps, after all, it had been merely an illusion, for folk do not see clearly in the mist, and I was already done with weariness. But even as I lay in the green moss and began to hope, the faces of my pursuers grew up through the mist. I stumbled madly to my feet, but I was hemmed in, the rock behind, and my enemies before. With a cry, I rushed forward and struck wildly with my rod at the first dark body. It was as if I had struck an animal, and the next second the thing was wrenched from my grasp. But still, they came no nearer. I stood trembling there, in the centre of those malignant devils, my brain a mere weathercock, and my heart crushed shapeless with horror. At last the end came, for with the vigour of madness I flung myself on the nearest, and we rolled on the ground. Then the monstrous things seemed to close over me, and with a choking cry I passed into unconsciousness. 4. The darkness that is under the earth. There is an unconscious that is not wholly dead, where a man feels numbly and the body lives without the brain. I was beyond speech or thought, and yet I felt the upward or downward motion as the way lay in hill or glen, and I almost assuredly knew when the open air was changed for the close underground. I could feel dimly the lights that flared in my face, and that I was laid in some bed on the earth. Then, with the stopping of movement, the real sleep of weakness seized me, and for long I knew nothing of this mad world. Morning came over the moors with birdsong and the glory of fine weather. The streams were rolling in spate, but the hill pastures were alight with dawn, and the little seams of snow glistening like white fire. A ray from the sunrise cleft its path somehow into the abyss, and danced on the wall above my couch. It caught my eye as I wakened, and for long I lay, crazily wondering what it meant. My head was splitting with pain, and in my heart was the same fluttering, nameless fear. I did not wake to full consciousness, not till the twinkle of sun from the clean, bright out-of-doors caught my senses did I realize that I lay in a great dark place with a glow of dull firelight in the middle. In time, things rose and moved around me, a few ragged shapes of men, without clothing, shambling with their huge feet and looking towards me with curved, beast-like glances. I tried to marshal my thoughts, and slowly, bit by bit, I built up the present. There was no question to my mind of dreaming. The past hours had scored reality upon my brain, yet I cannot say that fear was my chief feeling. The first crazy terror had subsided, and now I felt mainly a sickened disgust with just a tinge of curiosity. I found that my knife, watch, flask, and money had gone, but they had left me a map of the countryside. It seemed strange to look at the calico with the name of a London printer stamped on the back, and lines of railway and high road running through every shire, decent and comfortable civilization, and here I was, a prisoner in this den of nameless folk, in the midst of a life which history knew not. Courage is a virtue which grows with reflection and the absence of the immediate peril. I thought myself into some sort of resolution, and lo, when the folk approached me and bound my feet, I was back at once in the most miserable terror. They tied me, all but my hands, with some strong cord, and carried me to the centre, where the fire was glowing. Their soft touch was the acutest torture to my nerves, but I stifled my cries, lest someone should lay his hand on my mouth. Had that happened, I am convinced my reason would have failed me. So there I lay in the shine of the fire, with the circle of unknown things around me. There seemed but 3 or 4, but I took no note of number. They talked huskily among themselves, in a tongue which sounded all gutturals. Slowly, my fear became less an emotion than a habit, and I had room for the smallest shade of curiosity. I strained my ear to catch a word, but it was a mere chaos of sound. The thing ran and thundered in my brain as I stared dumbly into the vacant air. Then I thought that unless I spoke, I should go crazy, for my head was beginning to swim at the strange cooing noise. I spoke a word or two in my best Gaelic, and they closed around me inquiringly. Then I was sorry I had spoken, for my words had brought them nearer, and I shrank at the thought. But as the faint echoes of my speech hummed in the rock chamber, I was struck by a curious kinship of sound. Mine was sharper, more distinct, and staccato. Theirs was blurred, formless, but still with certain root resemblance. Then, from the back, there came an older being, who seemed to have heard my words. He was like some foul, grey badger, his red eyes sightless, and his hands trembled on a stump of bog oak. The others made way for him with such deference as they were capable of, and the thing squatted down by me and spoke. To my amazement, his words were familiar. It was some manner of speech akin to the Gaelic, but broadened, lengthened, coarsened. I remembered an old book tongue, commonly supposed to be an impure dialect, once used in Brittany, which I had met in the course of my researches. The words recalled it, and as far as I could remember the thing, I asked him who he was and where the place might be. He answered me in the same speech, still more broadened, lengthened, coarsened. I lay back with sheer amazement. I had found the key to this unearthly life. For a little, an insatiable curiosity, the ardour of the scholar, prevailed. I forgot the horror of the place, and thought only of the fact that here before me was the greatest find that scholarship had ever made. I was precipitated into the heart of the past. Here must be the fountainhead of all legends, the chrysalis of all beliefs. I actually grew light-hearted. This strange folk around me were now no more shapeless things of terror, but objects of research and experiment. I almost came to think them not unfriendly. For an hour, I enjoyed the highest of earthly pleasures. In that strange conversation I heard, in fragments and suggestions, the history of the craziest survival the world has ever seen. I heard of the struggles with invaders, preserved, as it were, in a sort of shapeless poetry. There were bitter words against the Gaelic oppressor, bitterer words against the Saxon stranger, and for a moment ancient hatreds flared into life. Then there came the tale of the hill refuge, the morbid, hideous existence preserved for centuries amid a changing world. I heard fragments of old religions, primeval names of god and goddess, half understood by the folk, but to me the key to 100 puzzles. Tales which survive to us in broken, disjointed riddles were intact here in living form. I lay on my elbow and questioned feverishly. At any moment they might become morose and refuse to speak. Clearly, it was my duty to make the most of a brief good fortune. And then the tale they told me grew more hideous. I heard of the circumstances of the life itself, and their daily shifts for existence. It was a murderous chronicle, a history of lust and rapine, and unmentionable deeds in the darkness. One thing they had early recognized, that the race could not be maintained within itself. So that ghoulish carrying away of little girls from the lowlands began, which I had heard of, but never credited. Shut up in those dismal holes, the girls soon died, and when the new race had grown up, the plunder had been repeated. Then there were bestial murders in lonely cottages, done for God knows what purpose. Sometimes the occupant had seen more than was safe. Sometimes the deed was the mere exuberance of a lust of slaying. As they gabbled their tales, my heart's blood froze, and I lay back in the agonies of fear. If they had used the others thus, what way of escape was open for myself? I had been brought to this place and not murdered on the spot. Clearly, there was torture before death in store for me, and I confess I quailed at the thought. But none molested me. The elders continued to jabber out their stories, while I lay tense and deaf. Then, to my amazement, food was brought and placed beside me, almost with respect. Clearly, my murder was not a thing of the immediate future. The meal was some form of mutton, perhaps the shepherd's lost ewes, and a little smoking was all the cooking it had got. I strove to eat, but the tasteless morsels choked me. Then they set a drink before me in a curious cup, which I seized on eagerly, for my mouth was dry with thirst. The vessel was of gold, rudely formed, but of the pure metal, and a coarse design in circles ran around the middle. This surprised me enough, but a great wonder awaited me. The liquor was not water, as I had guessed, but a sort of sweet ale, a miracle of flavor. The taste was curious, but somehow familiar. It was like no wine I had ever drunk, and yet I had known that flavor all my life. I sniffed at the brim, and there rose a faint fragrance of thyme and heather honey and the sweet things of the moorland. I almost dropped the thing in my surprise, for here in this rude place I had stumbled upon that lost delicacy of the north, the heather ale. For a minute I was entranced with my discovery, and then the wonder of the cup claimed my attention. Was it a mere relic of pillage, or had this folk had some hidden mine of the precious metal? Gold had once been common in these hills. There were traces of mines on Cairnsmore. Shepherds had found it in the gravel of the Geld water, and the name of a house at the head of the Clacklands meant Home of Gold. Once more I began my questions, and they answered them willingly. There and then I heard that secret for which many had died in old time, the secret of the heather ale. They told me of the gold in the hills, of corries where the sand gleamed, and abysses where the rocks were veined. All this they told me freely, without a scruple, and then, like a clap, came the awful thought that this too spelled death. These were secrets which this race aforetime had guarded with their lives. They told them generously to me because there was no fear of betrayal. I should go no more out from this place. The thought put me in a new sweat of terror, not at death, mind you, but at the unknown horrors which might precede the final suffering. I lay silent, and after binding my hands, they began to leave me and go off to other parts of the cave. I dozed in the horrible half-swoon of fear, conscious only of my shaking limbs and the great dull glow of the fire in the centre. Then I became calmer. After all, they had treated me with tolerable kindness. I had spoken their language, which few of their victims could have done for many a century. It might be that I found favour in their eyes. For a little I comforted myself with this delusion, till I caught sight of a wooden box in a corner. It was of modern make, one such as grocers used to pack provisions in. It had some address nailed on it, and an aimless curiosity compelled me to creep thither and read it. A torn and weather-stained scrap of paper, with the nails at the corner rusty with age, but something of the address might still be made out. Amid the stains my feverish eyes read, to Mr. M. Carrickfay, by Allerfoot Station. The ruined cottage at the hollow of the waste, with the single gnarled apple tree, was before me in a twinkling. I remembered the shepherd's shrinking from the place, and the name, and his wild eyes when he told me of the thing that had happened there. I seemed to see the old man in his moorland cottage, thinking no evil, the sudden entry of the nameless things, and then the eyes glazed in unspeakable terror. I felt my lips dry and burning. Above me was the vault of rock. In the distance, I saw the fire glow, and the shadows of shapes moving around it. My fright was too great for an action, so I crept from the couch, and silently, stealthily, with tottering steps and bursting heart, I began to reconnoitre. But I was still bound, my arms tightly, my legs more loosely, but yet firm enough to hinder flight. I could not get my hands at my leg straps. Still less could I undo the manacles. I rolled on the floor, seeking some sharp edge of rock, but all had been worn smooth by the use of centuries. Then suddenly an idea came upon me like an inspiration. The sounds from the fire seemed to have ceased, and I could hear them repeated from another and more distant part of the cave. The folk had left their orgy round the blaze, and at the end of the long tunnel I saw its glow fall unimpeded upon the floor. Once there, I might burn off my fetters and be free to turn my thoughts to escape. I crawled a little way with much labour. Then, suddenly, I came abreast on an opening in the wall, through which a path went. It was a long, straight rock cutting, and at the end I saw a pale gleam of light. It must be the open air. A way of escape was prepared for me, and with a prayer I made what speed I could towards the fire. I rolled on the verge, but the fuel was peat, and the warm ashes would not burn the cords. In desperation I went farther, and my clothes began to singe, while my face ached beyond endurance. But yet I got no nearer my object. The strips of hide warped and cracked, but did not burn. Then, in a last effort, I thrust my wrists bodily into the glow and held them there. In an instant I drew them out with a groan of pain, scarred and sore, but to my joy the band snapped in one place. Weak as I was, it was now easy to free myself, and then came the untying of my legs. My hands trembled, my eyes were dazed with hurry, and I was longer over the job than need have been. But at last I had loosened my cramped knees and stood on my feet, a free man once more. I kicked off my boots and fled noiselessly down the passage to the tunnel mouth. Apparently, it was close on evening, for the white light had faded to pale yellow. But it was daylight, and that was all I sought, and I ran for it, as eagerly as ever runner ran to a goal. I came out on a rock shelf, beneath which a moraine of boulders fell away in a chasm to a dark loch. It was all but night, but I could see the gnarled and fortressed rocks rise in ramparts above me, and below the unknown screes and cliffs which made the side of the Monorail a place only for foxes and the fowls of the air. The first taste of liberty is an intoxication, and assuredly I was mad when I leapt down among the boulders. Happily, at the top of the gully, the stones were large and stable, else the noise would certainly have discovered me. Down I went, slipping, praying, my charred wrists aching, and my stockinged feet wet with blood. Soon I was in the jaws of the cleft, and a pale star rose before me. I had always been timid in the face of great rocks, and now, had not an awful terror been dogging my footsteps, no power on earth could have driven me to that descent. Soon I left the boulders behind, and came to long spouts of little stones, which moved with me till the hillside seemed sinking under my feet. Sometimes I was face downwards. Once and again I must have fallen for yards. Had there been a cliff at the foot, I should have gone over it without resistance, but by the providence of God, the spout ended in a long curve into the heather of the bog. When I found my feet once more on soft boggy earth, my strength was renewed in me. A great hope of escape sprang up in my heart. For a second I looked back. There was a great line of shingle with the cliffs beyond, and above all, the unknown blackness of the cleft. There lay my terror, and I set off running across the bog for dear life. My mind was clear enough to know my road. If I held round the loch in front, I should come to a burn which fed the Farawa stream, on whose banks stood the shepherd's cottage. The loch could not be far. Once at the Farawa, I would have the light of the shieling clear before me. Suddenly, I heard behind me, as if coming from the hillside, the patter of feet. It was the sound which white hares make in the winter time on a noiseless frosty day as they patter over the snow. I've heard the same soft noise from a herd of deer when they changed their pastures. Strange that so kindly a sound should put the very fear of death in my heart. I ran madly, blindly, yet thinking shrewdly. The loch was before me. Somewhere I had read or heard, I do not know where, that the brutish aboriginal races of the north could not swim. I swam myself powerfully. Could I but cross the loch, I should save 2 miles of a desperate country. There was no time to lose, for the patter was coming nearer, and I was almost at the loch's edge. I tore off my coat and rushed in. The bottom was mossy, and I had to struggle far before I found any depth. Something splashed in the water before me, and then something else a little behind. The thought that I was a mark for unknown missiles made me crazy with fright, and I struck fiercely out for the other shore. A gleam of moonlight was on the water at the burn's exit, and thither I guided myself. I found the thing difficult enough in itself, for my hands ached, and I was numb with my bonds. But my fancy raised 1,000 phantoms to vex me. Swimming in that black bog water, pursued by those nameless things, I seemed to be in a world of horror, far removed from the kindly world of men. My strength seemed inexhaustible from my terror. Monsters at the bottom of the water seemed to bite at my feet, and the pain of my wrists made me believe that the lock was boiling hot, and that I was in some hellish place of torment. I came out on a spit of gravel above the burn mouth and set off down the ravine of the burn. It was a straight place, strewn with rocks, but now and then the hill turf came in stretches and eased my wounded feet. Soon the fall became more abrupt, and I was slipping down a hillside, with the water on my left making great cascades in the granite. And then I was out in the wider vale, where the Farawa water flowed among links of moss. Far in front, a speck in the blue darkness, shone the light of the cottage. I panted forward, my breaths coming in gasps, and my back shot with fiery pains. Happily, the land was easier for the feet as long as I kept on the skirts of the bog. My ears were sharp as a wild beast's with fear, as I listened for the noise of pursuit. Nothing came but the rustle of the gentlest hill wind and the chatter of the falling streams. Then suddenly the light began to waver and move athwart the window. I knew what it meant. In a minute or two, the household at the cottage would retire to rest, and the lamp would be put out. True, I might find the place in the dark, for there was a moon of sorts, and the road was not desperate. But somehow, in that hour, the lamplight gave a promise of safety which I clung to despairingly. And then the last straw was added to my misery. Behind me came the pad of feet, the pat-patter, soft, eerie, incredibly swift. I choked with fear and flung myself forward in a last effort. I give my word, it was sheer mechanical shrinking that drove me on. God knows I would have lain down to die in the heather had the things behind me been a common terror of life. I ran as man never ran before, leaping hags, scrambling through green well-heads, straining towards the fast-dying light. A quarter of a mile, and the patter sounded nearer. Soon I was not 200 yards off, and the noise seemed almost at my elbow. The light went out, and the black mass of the cottage loomed in the dark. Then, before I knew, I was at the door, battering it wearily and yelling for help. I heard steps within and a hand on the bolt. Then something shot past me with lightning force and buried itself in the wood. The dreadful hands were almost at my throat when the door was opened and I stumbled in, hearing with a gulp of joy the key turn and the bar fall behind me. "5. The Troubles of a Conscience." My body and senses slept, for I was utterly tired, but my brain all the night was on fire with horrid fancies. Again, I was in that accursed cave. I was torturing my hands in the fire. I was slipping barefoot among jagged boulders, and then, with bursting heart, I was toiling the last mile with the cottage light, now grown to a great fire in the heavens, blazing before me. It was broad daylight when I awoke, and thanked God for the comfortable rays of the sun. I had been laid in a box bed off the inner room, and my first sight was the shepherd sitting with folded arms in a chair, regarding me solemnly. I rose and began to dress, feeling my legs and arms still tremble with weariness. The shepherd's sister bound up my scarred wrists and put an ointment on my burns, and limping like an old man, I went to the kitchen. I could eat little breakfast, for my throat seemed dry and narrow, but they gave me some brandy and milk, which put strength into my body. All the time, the brother and sister sat in silence, regarding me with covert glances. "Ye have been delivered from the jaws of the pit," said the man at length. "See that." He held out to me a thin shaft of flint. "I found that in the door this morning." I took it, let it drop, and stared vacantly at the window. My nerves had been too much tried to be roused by any new terror. Out of doors it was fair weather, flying gleams of April sunlight and the soft colours of spring. I felt dazed, isolated, cut off from my easy past and pleasing future, a companion of horrors and the sport of nameless things. Then suddenly my eye fell on my books, heaped on the table, and the old distant civilization seemed for the moment inexpressibly dear. "I must go, at once, and you must come too. You cannot stay here. I tell you, it is death. If you knew what I know, you would be crying out with fear. How far is it to Alamir? 15 miles, and then 10 down Glen Alla to Allafoot, and then the railway. We must go together while it's daylight, and perhaps we may be untouched. But quick, there is not a moment to lose." And I was on my shaky feet and bustling among my possessions. "I'll gae with ye to the station," said the shepherd, "for ye clearly no fit to look after yourself. My sister will bide and keep the house. If naething has touched us this 10 year, naething will touch us the day." "But you cannot stay. You are mad," I began, but he cut me short with the words, "I trust in God." "In any case, let your sister come with us. I dare not think of a woman alone in this place." "I'll bide," said she. "I'm no feared, as lang as I'm indoors, and there's stakes on the windays." So I packed my few belongings as best I could, tumbled my bookcases into a haversack, and, gripping the shepherd's arm nervously, crossed the threshold. The glen was full of sunlight. There lay the long shining links of the Farawa burn, the rough hills tumbled beyond, and far over all the scarred and distant forehead of the Monorail. I had always looked on moor country as the freshest on earth, clean, wholesome, and homely, but now the fresh uplands seemed like a horrible pit. When I looked to the hills, my breath choked in my throat, and the feel of soft heather below my feet set my heart trembling. It was a slow journey to the inn at Alamir. For one thing, no power on earth could draw me within sight of the Shielding of Farawa. So we had to cross a shoulder of hill and make our way down a difficult glen, and then over a treacherous moss. The lochs were now gleaming like fretted silver, but to me, in my dreadful knowledge, they seemed more eerie than on that grey day when I came. At last my eyes were cheered by the sight of a meadow and a fence. Then we were on a little by-road, and soon the firwoods and cornlands of Ala Cloich were plain before us. The shepherd came no farther, but with brief goodbye turned his solemn face hillward. I hired a trap and a man to drive, and down the 10 miles of Glen Alla I struggled to keep my thoughts from the past. I thought of the kindly south country, of Oxford, of anything comfortable and civilized. My driver pointed out the objects of interest, as in duty bound, but his words fell on unheeding ears. At last, he said something which roused me, indeed, to interest, the interest of a man who hears the word he fears most in the world. On the left side of the river, there suddenly sprang into view a long, gloomy cleft in the hills, with a vista of dark mountains beyond, down which a stream of considerable size poured its water. "That is the water of Duel," said the man in a reverent voice. "A ground water to fish, but dangerous to life, for it's a lens. Away at the Hyde, they say there's a terrible place called the Scarts of the Monorail. That's a shoulder of the Muckle Hill itself, the E.C. But I've never been there, and I never kent any man that had either." At the station, which is a mile from the village of Allafoot, I found I had some hours to wait on my train for the south. I dared not trust myself for one moment alone, So I hung about the goods shed, talking vacantly to the porters, and when one went to the village for tea, I accompanied him, and to his wonder entertained him at the inn. When I returned, I found on the platform a stray bagman who was that evening going to London. If there is one class of men in the world which I heartily detest, it is this. But such was my state that I hailed him as a brother, and besought his company. I paid the difference for a first-class fare, and had him in the carriage with me. He must have thought me an amiable maniac, for I talked in fits and starts, and when he fell asleep, I would wake him and beseech him to speak to me. At wayside stations, I would pull down the blinds in case of recognition, for to my unquiet mind the world seemed full of spies sent by that terrible folk of the hills. When the train crossed a stretch of moor, I would lie down on the seat in case of shafts fired from the heather. And then at last, with utter weariness, I fell asleep, and woke screaming about midnight to find myself well down in the cheerful English Midlands, and red blast furnaces blinking on the railway side. In the morning I breakfasted in my rooms at St. Chad's with a dawning sense of safety. I was in a different and calmer world. The lawn-like quadrangles, the great trees, the cawing of rooks, and the homely twitter of sparrows, all seemed decent and settled and pleasing. Indoors, the oak-panelled walls, the shelves of books, the pictures, the faint fragrance of tobacco, were very different from the grim-crack adornments and the accursed smell of peat and heather in that deplorable cottage. It was still vacation time, so most of my friends were down, but I spent the day hunting out the few cheerful pedants to whom term and vacation were the same. It delighted me to hear again their precise talk, to hear them make a boast of their work, and narrate the childish little accidents of their life. I yearned for the childish once more. I craved for women's drawing rooms and women's chatter, and everything which makes life an elegant game. God knows I had enough of the other thing for a lifetime. That night I shut myself in my rooms, barred my windows, drew my curtains, and made a great destruction. All books or pictures which recalled me to the moorlands were ruthlessly doomed. Novels, poems, treatises, I flung into an old box for sale to a second-hand bookseller. Some prints and watercolour sketches I tore to pieces with my own hands. I ransacked my fishing book and condemned all tackle for moorland waters to the flames. I wrote a letter to my solicitors, bidding them to go no further in the purchase of a place in Lorne I had long been thinking of. Then, and not till then, did I feel the bondage of the pass a little loosened from my shoulders. I made myself a nightcap of rum punch instead of my usual whiskey toddy, that all associations with that dismal land might be forgotten, and to complete the renunciation, returned to cigars and flung my pipe into a drawer. But when I woke in the morning, I found that it is hard to get rid of memories. My feet were still sore and wounded, and when I felt my arms cramped and reflected on the causes, there was the black memory always near to vex me. In a little, term began, and my duties as Deputy Professor of Northern Antiquities were once more clamorous. I can well believe that my hearers found my lectures strange, for instead of dealing with my favourite subjects and matters, which I might modestly say I had made my own, I confined myself to recondite and distant themes, treating even these cursorily and dully. For the truth is, my heart was no more in my subject. I hated, or I thought that I hated, all things northern with the virulence of utter fear. My reading was confined to science of the most recent kind, to abstruse philosophy, and to foreign classics. Anything which savoured of romance or mystery was abhorrent. I pined for sharp outlines and the tangibility of a high civilization. All the term I threw myself into the most frivolous life of the place. My Harrow schooldays seemed to have come back to me. I had once been a fair cricketer, so I played again for my college and made decent scores. I coached an indifferent crew on the river. I fell into the slang of the place, which I had hitherto detested. My former friends looked on me askance, as if some freakish changeling had possessed me. Formerly, I had been ready for pedantic discussion. I had been absorbed in my work. Men had spoken of me as a rising scholar. Now, I fled the very mention of things I had once delighted in. The professor of northern antiquities, a scholar of European reputation, meeting me once in the parks, embarked on an account of certain novel rings recently found in Scotland, and to his horror found that, when he got well under way, I had slipped off unnoticed. I heard afterwards that the good old man was found by a friend walking disconsolately with bowed head in the middle of the high street. Being rescued from among the horse's feet, he could only murmur, "I'm thinking of graves, poor man, and a year ago he was as sane as I am." But a man may not long deceive himself. I kept up the illusion valiantly for the first term, but I felt instinctively that the fresh schoolboy life, which seemed to me the extreme opposite to the ghoulish north, and as such the most desirable of things, was eternally cut off from me. No cunning affectation could ever dispel my real nature or efface the memory of a week. I realized miserably that sooner or later I must fight it out with my conscience. I began to call myself a coward. The chief thoughts of my mind began to center themselves more and more round that unknown life waiting to be explored among the unfathomable wilds. One day I met a friend, an official in the British Museum, who was full of some new theory about primitive habitations. To me it seemed inconceivably absurd, but he was strong in his confidence, and without flaw in his evidence. The man irritated me, and I burned to prove him wrong, but I could think of no argument which was final against his. Then it flashed upon me that my own experience held the disproof, and without more words I left him, hot, angry with myself, and tantalized by the unattainable. I might relate my bona fide experience, but would men believe me? I must bring proofs. I must complete my researches, so as to make them incapable of disbelief. And there, in those deserts, was waiting the key. There lay the greatest discovery of the century, nay, of the millennium. There, too, lay the road to wealth, such as I never dreamed of. Could I succeed, I should be famous forever. I would revolutionize history and anthropology. I would systematize folklore. I would show the world of men the pit whence they were digged and the rock whence they were hewn. And then began a game of battledore between myself and my conscience. "You are a coward," said my conscience. "I am sufficiently brave," I would answer. "I have seen things and yet lived. The terror is more than mortal, and I cannot face it." "You are a coward," said my conscience. "I am not bound to go there again. It would be purely for my own aggrandizement if I went, and not for any matter of duty." "Nevertheless, you are a coward," said my conscience. "In any case, the matter can wait." "You are a coward." Then came one awful midsummer night, when I lay sleepless and fought the thing out with myself. I knew that the strife was hopeless, that I should have no peace in this world again unless I made the attempt. The dawn was breaking when I came to my final resolution, and when I rose and looked at my face in a mirror, lo, it was white and lined and drawn like a man of 60. "6. Summer on the Moors." The next morning, I packed a bag with some changes of clothing and a collection of notebooks and went up to town. The first thing I did was to pay a visit to my solicitors. "I am about to travel," said I, and I wished to have things settled in case any accident should happen to me. So I arranged for the disposal of my property in case of my death, and added a codicil which puzzled the lawyers. If I did not return within 6 months, communications were to be entered into with the shepherd at the Shielding of Farawa, post town Alafoot. If he could produce any papers, they were to be put into the hands of certain friends, published, and the cost charged to my estate. From my solicitors, I went to a gunmaker's in Regent Street and bought an ordinary 6-chambered revolver, feeling much as a man must feel who proposed to cross the Atlantic in a skiff and purchased a small lifebelt as a precaution. I took the night express to the north, and, for a marvel, I slept. When I woke about 4, we were on the verge of Westmoreland, and stony hills blocked the horizon. At first, I hailed the mountain land gladly. Sleep, for the moment, had caused forgetfulness of my terrors, but soon a turn of the line brought me in full view of a heathery moor, running far to a confusion of distant peaks. I remembered my mission and my fate, and if ever condemned criminal felt a more bitter regret, I pity his case. Why should I alone among the millions of this happy isle be singled out as the repository of a ghastly secret, and be cursed by a conscience which would not let it rest? I came to Alafoot early in the afternoon, and got a trap to drive me up the valley. It was a lowering grey day, hot and yet sunless. A sort of heat haze cloaked the hills, and every now and then a smurr of rain would meet us on the road, and in a minute be over. I felt wretchedly dispirited, and when at last the whitewashed kirk of Alarmuir came into sight and the broken-backed bridge of Allah, man's eyes seemed to have looked on no drearer a scene since time began. I ate what meal I could get, for, fears or no, I was voraciously hungry. Then I asked the landlord to find me some man who would show me the road to Farawa. I demanded company, not for protection, for what could 2 men do against such brutish strength, but to keep my mind from its own thoughts. The man looked at me anxiously. "Are ye acquaint with the folks, then?" he asked. I said I was, and that I often stayed at the cottage. "Ye ken they've a name for being queer. The man never comes here forby once or twice a year, and he has few dealings with other herds. He's got an ill name, too, for losing sheep. I dinna like the country of up by yon Monorail, nor that I've ever been there, but I've seen it far off, is enough to put a man daft for the rest of his days. What's taken ye thereaways? It's no the time for fishing." I told him that I was a botanist going to explore certain hill crevices for rare ferns. He shook his head, and then, after some delay, found me an ostler who would accompany me to the cottage. The man was a shock-headed, long-limbed fellow, with fierce red hair and a humorous eye. He talked sociably about his life, answered my hasty questions with deftness, and beguiled me, for the moment, out of myself. I passed the melancholy lochs, and came in sight of the great stony hills without the trepidation I had expected. Here, at my side, was one who found some humour even in those uplands. But one thing I noted brought back the old uneasiness. He took the road which led us farthest from Carrickfay, and when to try him I proposed the other, he vetoed it with emphasis. After this his good spirits departed, and he grew distrustful. "What makes ye a friend of the herd at Farawa?" he demanded a dozen times. Finally, I asked him if he knew the man, and had seen him lately. "I dinna ken him. I hadna seen him for years, till a fortnight sin, when all Alarmuir saw him. He came doon one afternoon to the public house, and be good to drink. He had aye been kenned for a terribly godly kind of man, and ye may believe folk wondered at this. But when he had stuck to the drink for 2 days, and filled himself blind fou 6 of times, He took a fit of repentance and raved and blathered about sicking a life as he had lived in the muirs. There was some said he was speaking serious, but maist thought he was just daftness. And what did he speak about? I asked sharply. I canna very well tell ye. It was aboot some kind of bogle that lived in the Monorail. That's as sure as out ye see yonder. And it seemed that the bogle killed his sheep and frightened himself. He was aye blatherin' too, about something or somebody called grave, but oh, the man wasna wise. And my companion shook a contemptuous head. And then, below us in the valley, we saw the shieling, with a thin shaft of smoke rising into the rainy grey weather. The man left me, sturdily refusing my fee. I wanted my legs stretched as well as ye. A walk in the hills is neither here nor there to a astute man. When will ye be back, sir? The question was well timed. Tomorrow fortnight, I said, and I want somebody from Alamure to come out here in the morning and carry some baggage. Will you see to that? He said aye, and went off, while I scrambled down the hill to the cottage. Nervousness possessed me, and though it was broad daylight and the whole place lay plain before me, I ran pell-mell and did not stop till I reached the door. The place was utterly empty. Unmade beds, unwashed dishes, a hearth strewn with the ashes of peat, and dust thick on everything, proclaimed the absence of inmates. I began to be horribly frightened. Had the shepherd and his sister also disappeared? Was I left alone in the bleak place with a dozen lonely miles between me and human dwellings? I could not return alone. Better this horrible place than the unknown perils of the out-of-doors. Hastily I barricaded the door, and to the best of my power shuttered the windows, and then, with dreary forebodings, I sat down to wait on fortune. In a little I heard a long, swinging step outside and the sound of dogs. Joyfully I opened the latch, and there was the shepherd's grim face, waiting stolidly on what might appear. At the sight of me he stepped back. "What in the Lord's name are ye doing here?" he asked. "Didna ye get enough afore?" "Come in," I said sharply. "I want to talk." In he came with those blessed dogs. What a comfort it was to look on their great honest faces. He sat down on the untidy bed and waited. I came because I could not stay away. I saw too much to give me any peace elsewhere. I must go back, even though I risk my life for it. The cause of scholarship demands it as well as the cause of humanity. "Is that all the news ye hear?" he said. "Well, I've mair to tell ye. 3 weeks sin my sister Margaret was lost, and I've never seen her mair." My jaw fell, and I could only stare at him. "I came hame from the hill of nightfall, and she was gone. I looked for her, up hill and doon, but I couldna find her. Sin, I think I went daft. I went to the Scarts, and hunted them up and doon, but no sign could I see. The folk can bide quiet enough when they want. Sin, I went to Alarmuir, and drank myself blind. Me, that's a God-fearing man, and a safe soul. But the Lord help me, I didna ken what I was at. That's my news, and day and night I wander the hills, seeking for what I canna find." "But man, are you mad?" I cried. "Surely there are neighbours to help you. There is law in the land, and you had only to find the nearest police office and compel them to assist you." "What good can man do?" he asked. "An army of soldiers couldna find that hidey hole. Forby, when I went into Alarmuir with my story, the folk thought me daft. It was that set me drinking, for, the Lord forgive me, I wasna my own master. I threeped till I was hairse, but the bodies just laughed." And he lay back on the bed like a man mortally tired. Grim though the tidings were, I can only say that my chief feeling was of comfort. Pity for the new tragedy had swallowed up my fear. I had now a purpose, and a purpose too, not of curiosity, but of mercy. "I will go tomorrow to the Monorail, But first I want to give you something to do. And I drew roughly a chart of the place on the back of a letter. Go to Alamure tomorrow and give this paper to the landlord at the inn. The letter will tell him what to do. He is to raise, at once, all the men he can get and come to the place on the chart marked with a cross. Tell him life depends upon his hurry. The shepherd nodded. Do ye ken the folk are watching for you? They let me pass without trouble, for they're nae use for me. But I say fine they're seeking you. Ye'll no go half a mile the morn afore they grip ye. So much the better, I said. That will make me quicker to the place I want to be at. And I am to gang to Alarmure the morning, he repeated, with the air of a child conning a lesson. But what if they'll no believe me? They'll believe the letter. Maybe, he said, and relapsed into a doze. I set myself to put the house in order, to rouse the fire, and prepare some food. It was dismal work, and meantime, outside the night darkened, and a great wind rose, which howled round the walls and lashed the rain on the windows. Seven. In tuas manos Domine. I had not got 20 yards from the cottage door ere I knew I was watched. I had left the shepherd still dozing, in the half-conscious state of a dazed and broken man. All night the wind had wakened me at intervals, and now, in the half-light of morn, the weather seemed more vicious than ever. The wind cut my ears. The whole firmament was full of the rendings and thunders of the storm. Rain fell in blinding sheets. The heath was a marsh, and it was the most I could do to struggle against the hurricane which stopped my breath. And all the while, I knew I was not alone in the desert. All men know, in imagination or in experience, the sensation of being spied on. The nerves tingle, the skin grows hot and prickly. There is a queer sinking of the heart. Intensify this common feeling 100-fold, and you get a 10th part of what I suffered. I am telling a plain tale and recording bare physical facts. My lips stood out from my teeth as I heard, or felt, a rustle in the heather, a scraping among stones. Some subtle magnetic link seemed established between my body and the mysterious world around. I became sick, acutely sick, with this ceaseless apprehension. My fright became so complete that when I turned a corner of rock or stepped in deep heather, I seemed to feel a body rub against me. This continued all the way up the Farawa water, and then up its feeder to the little lonely loch. It kept me looking forward, but it likewise kept me in such a sweat of fright that I was ready to faint. Then the notion came upon me to test this fancy of mine. If I was tracked thus closely, clearly the trackers would bar my way if I turned back. So I wheeled round and walked a dozen paces down the glen. Nothing stopped me. I was about to turn again when something made me take 6 more paces. At the 4th, something rustled in the heather, and my neck was gripped as in a vice. I had already made up my mind on what I would do. I would be perfectly still. I would conquer my fear and let them do as they pleased with me, so long as they took me to their dwelling. But at the touch of the hands, my resolutions fled. I struggled and screamed. Then something was clapped on my mouth. Speech and strength went from me, and once more I was back in the maudlin childhood of terror. In the cave, it was always a dusky twilight. I seemed to be lying in the same place, with the same dull glare of firelight far off, and the same close, stupefying smell. One of the creatures was standing silently at my side, and I asked him some trivial question, He turned and shambled down the passage, leaving me alone. Then he returned with another, and they talked their guttural talk to me. I scarcely listened till I remembered that, in a sense, I was here of my own accord, and on a definite mission. The purport of their speech seemed to be that, now I had returned, I must beware of a second flight. Once I had been spared, a second time I should be killed without mercy. I assented gladly. The folk, then, had some use for me. I felt my errand prospering. Then the old creature, which I had seen before, crept out of some corner and squatted beside me. He put a claw on my shoulder, a horrible, corrugated, skeleton thing, hairy to the fingertips and nailless. He grinned, too, with toothless gums, and his hideous old voice was like a file on sandstone. I asked questions, but he would only grin and jabber, looking now and then furtively over his shoulder towards the fire. I coaxed and humoured him, till he launched into a narrative of which I could make nothing. It seemed a mere string of names, with certain words repeated at fixed intervals. Then it flashed on me that this might be a religious incantation. I had discovered remnants of a ritual and a mythology among them. It was possible that these were sacred days, and that I had stumbled upon some rude celebration. I caught a word or two and repeated them. He looked at me curiously. Then I asked him some leading question, and he replied with clearness. My guess was right. The midsummer week was the holy season of the year, when sacrifices were offered to the gods. The notion of sacrifices disquieted me, and I would fain have asked further, but the creature would speak no more. He hobbled off and left me alone in the rock chamber to listen to a strange sound which hung ceaselessly about me. It must be a storm without, like a pack of artillery rattling among the crags. A storm of storms, surely, for the place echoed and hummed. Apparently my existence was forgotten, for I lay long before anyone returned. Then it was merely one who brought food, the same strange meal as before, and left hastily. When I had eaten, I rose and stretched myself. My hands and knees still quivered nervously, but I was strong and perfectly well in body. The empty, desolate, tomb-like place was eerie enough to scare anyone, but its emptiness was comfort when I thought of its inmates. Then I wandered down the passage towards the fire, which was burning in loneliness. Where had the folk gone? I puzzled over their disappearance. Suddenly, sounds began to break on my ear, coming from some inner chamber at the end of that in which the fire burned. I could scarcely see for the smoke, but I began to make my way towards the noise, feeling along the sides of rock. Then a second gleam of light seemed to rise before me, and I came to an aperture in the wall which gave entrance to another room. This, in turn, was full of smoke and glow, a murky orange glow, as if from some strange flame of roots. There were the squat, moving figures, running in wild antics around the fire. I crouched in the entrance, terrified and yet curious, till I saw something beyond the blaze which held me dumb. Apart from the others, and tied to some stake in the wall, was a woman's figure, and the face was the face of the shepherd's sister. My first impulse was flight. I must get away and think, plan, achieve some desperate way of escape. I sped back to the silent chamber as if the gang were at my heels. It was still empty, and I stood helplessly in the center, looking at the impassable walls of rock as a wearied beast may look at the walls of its cage. I bethought me of the way I had escaped before and rushed thither, only to find it blocked by a huge contrivance of stone. Yards and yards of solid rock were between me and the upper air, and yet through it all came the crash and whistle of the storm. If I were at my wits' end in this inner darkness, there was also high commotion among the powers of the air in the upper world. As I stood, I heard the soft steps of my tormentors. They seemed to think I was meditating escape, for they flung themselves on me and bore me to the ground. I did not struggle, and when they saw me quiet, they squatted round and began to speak. They told me of the holy season and its sacrifices. At first I could not follow them. Then, when I caught familiar words, I found some clue, and they became intelligible. They spoke of a woman, and I asked, "What woman?" With all frankness, they told me of the custom which prevailed, how every 20th summer a woman was sacrificed to some devilish god, and by the hand of one of the stranger race. I said nothing, but my whitening face must have told them a tale, though I strove hard to keep my composure. I asked if they had found the victims. "She is in this place," they said, "and as for the man, thou art he." And with this, they left me. I still had some hours, so much I gathered from their talk, for the sacrifice was at sunset. Escape was cut off forever. I have always been something of a fatalist, and at the prospect of the irrevocable end, my cheerfulness returned. I had my pistol, for they had taken nothing from me. I took out the little weapon and fingered it lovingly. Hope of the lost, refuge of the vanquished, ease to the coward. Blessed be he who first conceived it. The time dragged on, the minutes grew to hours, and still I was left solitary. Only the mad violence of the storm broke the quiet. It had increased in violence, for the stones at the mouth of the exit by which I had formerly escaped seemed to rock with some external pressure, and cutting shafts of wind slipped past and cleft the heat of the passage. What a sight the ravine outside must be, I thought, set in the forehead of a great hill and swept clean by every breeze. Then came a crashing and the long echo of a fall. "The rocks are splitting," said I. "The road down the corrie will be impassable now and forevermore." I began to grow weak with the nervousness of the waiting, and by I lay down and fell into a sort of doze. When I next knew consciousness, I was being roused by two of the folk and bidden get ready. I stumbled to my feet, felt for the pistol in the hollow of my sleeve, and prepared to follow. When we came out into the wider chamber, the noise of the storm was deafening. The roof rang like a shield which has been struck. I noticed, perturbed as I was, that my guards cast anxious eyes around them, alarmed, like myself, at the murderous din. Nor was the world quieter when we entered the last chamber, where the fire burned and the remnant of the folk waited. Wind had found an entrance from somewhere or other, and the flames blew here and there, and the grey smoke gyrated in odd circles. At the back, and apart from the rest, I saw the dazed eyes and the white, old, drawn face of the woman. They led me up beside her to a place where there was a rude, flat stone hollowed in the centre, and on it a rusty iron knife, which seemed once to have formed part of a scythe blade. Then I saw the ceremonial which was marked out for me. It was the very rite which I had dimly figured as current among a rude people, and even in that moment I had something of the scholar's satisfaction. The oldest of the folk, who seemed to be a sort of priest, came to my side and mumbled a form of words. His fetid breath sickened me, his dull eyes, glassy like a brute's with age, brought my knees together. He put the knife in my hands, dragged the terror-stricken woman forward to the altar, and bade me begin. I began by sawing her bonds through, When she felt herself free, she would have fled, but stopped when I bade her. At that moment there came a noise of rending and crashing, as if the hills were falling, and for 1 second the eyes of the folk were averted from the frustrated sacrifice. Only for a moment. The next they saw what I had done, and with one impulse rushed towards me. Then began the last scene in play. I sent a bullet through the right eye of the first thing that came on. The second shot went wide, but the third shattered the hand of an elderly ruffian with a cruel club. Never for an instant did they stop, and now they were clutching at me. I pushed the woman behind and fired 3 rapid shots in blind panic, and then, clutching the scythe, I struck right and left like a madman. Suddenly, I saw the foreground sink before my eyes. The roof sloped down, and with a sickening hiss, a mountain of rock and earth seemed to precipitate itself on my assailants. One, nipped in the middle by a rock, caught my eye by his hideous writhings. 2 only remained in what was now a little suffocating chamber, with embers of the fire still smoking on the floor. The woman caught me by the hand and drew me with her, while the 2 seemed mute with fear. "There's a road at the back," she screamed. "I ken it. I found it out." And she pulled me up a narrow hole in the rock. How long we climbed I do not know. We were both fighting for air, with the tightness of throat and chest and the craziness of limb, which mean suffocation. I cannot tell when we first came to the surface, but I remember the woman, who seemed to have the strength of extreme terror, pulling me from the edge of a crevasse and laying me on a flat rock. It seemed to be the depth of winter, with sheer falling rain and a wind that shook the hills. Then I was once more myself and could look about me. From my feet yawned a sheer abyss, where once had been a hill shoulder. Some great mass of rock on the brow of the mountain had been loosened by the storm, and in its fall had caught the lips of the ravine and swept the nest of dwellings into a yawning pit. Beneath the mountain of rubble lay buried that life on which I had thought to build my fame. My feeling, heaven help me, was not thankfulness for God's mercy in my escape, but a bitter, mad regret. I rushed frantically to the edge, and when I saw only the blackness of darkness, I wept weak tears. All the time the storm was tearing at my body, and I had to grip hard by hand and foot to keep my place. Suddenly, on the brink of the ravine, I saw a third figure. We 2 were not the only fugitives. One of the folk had escaped. The thought put new life into me, for I had lost the first fresh consciousness of terror. There still remained a relic of the vanished life. Could I but make this thing my prisoner, there would be proof in my hands to overcome a skeptical world. I ran to it, and in my surprise the thing, as soon as it saw me, rushed to meet me. At first I thought it was with some instinct of self-preservation, but when I saw its eyes, I knew the purpose of fight. Clearly one or the other should go no more from the place. We were 10 yards from the brink when I grappled with it. Dimly, I heard the woman scream with fright and saw her scramble across the hillside. Then we were tugging in a death throw, the hideous smell of the thing in my face, its red eyes burning into mine, and its hoarse voice muttering. Its strength seemed incredible, but I too am no weakling. We tugged and strained, its nails biting into my flesh, while I choked its throat unsparingly. Every second I dreaded lest we should plunge together over the ledge, for it was thither my adversary tried to draw me. I caught my heel in a nick of rock and pulled madly against it. And then, while I was beginning to glory with the pride of conquest, my hope was dashed to pieces. The thing seemed to break from my arms and, as if in despair, cast itself headlong into the impenetrable darkness. I stumbled blindly after it, saved myself on the brink, and fell back, sick and ill, into a merciful swoon. "8. A note by the editor. At this point, the narrative of my unfortunate friend, Mr. Graves of St. Chad's, breaks off abruptly. He wrote it shortly before his death, and was prevented from completing it by the shock of apoplexy which carried him off. In accordance with the instructions in his will, I have prepared it for publication, and now, in much fear and hesitation, give it to the world. First, however, I must supplement it by such facts as fall within my knowledge. The shepherd seems to have gone to Alarmuir, and by the help of the letter convinced the inhabitants. A body of men was collected under the landlord, and during the afternoon set out for the hills. But unfortunately, the great midsummer storm, the most terrible of recent climatic disturbances, had filled the mosses and streams, and they found themselves unable to proceed by any direct road. Ultimately, late in the evening, they arrived at the cottage of Farawa, only to find there a raving woman, the shepherd's sister, who seemed crazy with brain fever. She told some rambling story about her escape, but her narrative said nothing of Mr. Graves, so they treated her with what skill they possessed, and sheltered for the night in and around the cottage. Next morning the storm had abated a little, and the woman had recovered something of her wits. From her they learned that Mr. Graves was lying in a ravine on the side of the Monorail, in imminent danger of his life. A body set out to find him, but so immense was the landslip, and so dangerous the whole mountain, that it was nearly evening when they recovered him from the ledge of rock. He was alive, but unconscious, and on bringing him back to the cottage, it was clear that he was, indeed, very ill. There he lay for 3 months, while the best skill that could be got was procured for him. By dint of an uncommon toughness of constitution, he survived, but it was an old and feeble man who returned to Oxford in the early winter. The shepherd and his sister immediately left the countryside, and were never more heard of, unless they are the pair of unfortunates who are at present in a Scottish pauper asylum, incapable of remembering even their names. The people who last spoke with them declared that their minds seemed weakened by a great shock, and that it was hopeless to try to get any connected or rational statement. The career of my poor friend from that hour was little short of a tragedy. He awoke from his illness to find the world incredulous. Even the country folk of Alarmuir set down the story to the shepherd's craziness and my friend's credulity. In Oxford his argument was received with polite scorn. An account of his experiences, which he drew up for The Times, was refused by the editor, and an article on primitive peoples of the North, embodying what he believed to be the result of his discoveries, was unanimously rejected by every responsible journal in Europe. At first he bore the treatment bravely. Reflection convinced him that the colony had not been destroyed. Proofs were still awaiting in his hand, and with courage and caution he might yet triumph over his enemies. But, unfortunately, though the ardour of the scholar burned more fiercely than ever, and all fear seemed to have been purged from his soul, the last adventure had grievously sapped his bodily strength. In the spring following his accident, he made an effort to reach the spot, alone, for no one could be persuaded to follow him in what was regarded as a childish madness. He slept at the now deserted cottage of Farawa, but in the morning found himself unable to continue, and with difficulty struggled back to the shepherd's cottage at Alercloich, where he was confined to bed for a fortnight. Then it became necessary for him to seek health abroad, and it was not till the following autumn that he attempted the journey again. He fell sick a second time at the inn of Alarmuir, and during his convalescence had himself carried to a knoll in the inn garden, where a glimpse can be obtained of the shoulder of the Monorail. There he would sit for hours, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, and at times he would be found weeping with weakness and vexation. The last attempt was made but 2 months before his last illness. On this occasion, he got no farther than Carlisle, where he was taken ill with what proved to be a premonition of death. After that, he shut his lips tightly, as though recognizing the futility of his hopes. Whether he had been soured by the treatment he received, or whether his brain had already been weakened, he came to be a morose, silent man, and for the 2 years before his death had few friends and no society. From the obituary notice in The Times, I take the following paragraph, which shows in what light the world had come to look upon him. At the outset of his career, he was regarded as a rising scholar in one department of archaeology, and his Taffet lectures were a real contribution to an obscure subject. But in afterlife, he was led into fantastic speculations, and when he found himself unable to convince his colleagues, he gradually retired into himself and lived practically a hermit's life till his death. His career, thus broken short, is a sad instance of the fascination which the recondite and the quack can exercise even on men of approved ability. And now, his own narrative is published, and the world can judge as it pleases about the amazing romance. The view, which will doubtless find general acceptance, is that the whole is a figment of the brain, begotten of some harmless moorland adventure and the company of such religious maniacs as the shepherd and his sister. But some, who knew the former sobriety and calmness of my friend's mind, may be disposed timorously and with deep hesitation to another verdict. They may accept the narrative and believe that somewhere in those moorlands he met with a horrible, primitive survival, passed through the strange adventure, and had his finger on an epoch-making discovery. In this case, they will be inclined to sympathize with the loneliness and misunderstanding of his latter days. It is not for me to decide the question. Though a fellow historian, the Picts are outside my period, and I dare not advance an opinion on a matter with which I am not fully familiar. But I would point out that the means of settling the question are still extant, and I would call upon some young archaeologist with a reputation to make to seize upon the chance of the century. Most of the expresses for the north stop at Allerfoot. A 10 miles drive will bring him to Alamure, and then a 15 miles walk he is at Farawa and on the threshold of discovery. Let him follow the burn and cross the ridge and ascend the Scarts of the Monorail, and, if he return at all, it may be with a more charitable judgment of my unfortunate friend.